Welcome to The Cutting Floor, a weekly podcast of West Cannon Baptist Church.
Hi, I'm Emily, and with me is Pastor Zach. This week, your sermon covered Genesis 20. Who is Abimelech, and does his name have any significance?
So we're introduced to Abimelech as the king of Gerar, which, as we work our way through the rest of the narrative, we'll find out is not only located in kind of the region proximate to Gaza, but it's in kind of the heart of Philistia, and these are a Philistine people. So this is a Philistine king, perhaps not king of the Philistines. At this point, they're probably a little bit more tribally located, so he's a Philistine king, probably among other tribal kings of these different provinces related to the greater region and the people. But Abimelech is probably not a name, and more likely it's a title. And the reason that we say that is, number one, the name Abimelech means my father is king. So likely it is a designation for perhaps the firstborn son of whoever the preceding king is that marks out that child as the heir to the throne that gets passed on or is handed to whoever is king. It's a title. There may also even be a little bit of hint of some of the pagan roots there, because some commentators note that the El there in the Abimelech, that El may be a reference to God, because that's the word for El or Elohim. El is the singular, Elohim is the plural for God. So it may also, the name may mean my father, the God, is king. So it may be like others, pharaohs, for example, who believe that they were sons of the God, which is what gave them the right to rule. There may be something in this name that hints at the pagan beliefs of the Philistines as well. That's a little bit less clear. The reason why Abimelech is likely a title rather than simply a name is that later we'll see future people in Abraham's family interacting with Abimelech, also in Gerar, but more than 60 years later. And Abimelech will be referred to as will the commander of his army, Phicol, which is going to be picked up in the next chapter here in Genesis 21. So this Abimelech and Phicol would both have needed to remain king and commander of the armies for more than another 60 years for them to be the same two, Abimelech and Phicol, that are referenced in another story. Probably more likely, those were just the titles for the king and the Philistine commander of armies. And so those were formal political designations rather than proper names.
Why in verse 18 does it say that God closed the wombs of the women of the house of Abimelech on account of Sarah?
Well, I think at the very least we can say that God is emphasizing here the importance of the honor of Sarah and her purity remaining intact as it relates to the line of promise. I think probably the way that this was made known to Abimelech and to his people was kind of the cessation of the regular rhythms for all of these women resulted in an awareness that they're no longer able to have children. And within that, I think that there may even be a broader protection that God is putting in place. So number one, Abimelech is divinely prevented, we read, by God from approaching Sarah. So God keeps Abimelech from sinning. But also God keeps any children from being conceived or born during this time that Sarah is in captivity in Abimelech's household. In other words, there's not going to be the potential of a child being born in a time that would have occurred when Sarah was in this compromised position, or that was conceived when Sarah was in this compromised position, that anyone later is going to be able to say, you know what, that was actually Sarah's child and some other woman adopted it or they tried to cover it up. No, all of the wombs are closed so that it's very clear in this whole episode there were no children conceived while Sarah was in the household of Abimelech, so that without a shadow of any kind of reasonable doubt, we can say that the line of promise that is to be Abraham and Sarah together is not compromised as a result of Abraham's folly.
We know that Sarah was very beautiful, but it still seems odd that these kings would want to take a 90-year-old into their harem. Was she really just that beautiful, or was this a common practice of the culture?
So back in chapter 12, when this happened in Egypt, twice the text emphasizes that despite, at that point even, Sarah's advancing age, she retained remarkable beauty. later episodes, because this is going to happen again, not for Abraham and Sarah, but in later episodes in Genesis, there's going to be these similar stories where a sister fib is again committed. And once again, there's going to be a remark about the remarkable beauty that was involved in that caused this king to desire this woman. So it's conspicuous here in Genesis chapter 20 that Sarah is not described as beautiful in this text. Now, we know at this point that Sarah is approaching her 90s now. She's well advanced in years. So even if we were to kind of apply a patriarchal timeline to their lives, knowing how long that they live, and were to kind of read that back onto our average life expectancies, and it kind of rough equivalence, Sarah is somewhere in her mid-50s to early 60s at this point in time. So it's still even knowing her remarkable beauty, it still somewhat stretches belief that she is this unique object of desire for these kings. I think what we're seeing reflected is instead more of a political move on the part of Abimelech rather than a purely physical one. So Abimelech's desire, he sees Abraham, who we know is very well off. He's very wealthy. He's got a significant household at this point, a lot of flocks and animals. This is a powerful man, even if he's nomadic. And Abimelech sees Abraham, wants to be connected to Abraham's family in some way. So he takes this woman who apparently, from everything that he knows, is Abraham's sister. He joins himself to her in what he, I think, intends to be a kind of a political alliance. He's tying his fortunes in with Abraham, or maybe more the inverse, Abraham's fortunes in with Abimelech, and trying to establish some kind of legal claim between the two of them. So I think rather than a move that's motivated by lust, we see a move that's motivated by political strategy.
What lessons can husbands learn from Abraham's example?
We can learn a lot of negative examples, certainly. I think in general, and we've noted this already, we see in Abraham at times a remarkable passivity, such as in the Hagar episode where Sarah brings him this plan and he sort of steps back. He's like, you know what, whatever seems best to you. And then later when that doesn't work and Sarah's upset about that, Abraham again washes his hands of it and says, you know what, she's your servant, do with her whatever you want. I'm out. Well, in this text, we find Abraham being more active, but in a remarkably deceitful, unloving way toward his wife. So he not only commits the sin of basically lying or at least presenting the truth in a manipulative and deceitful way about his relationship with Sarah. No, she's just my sister. But we also read that he gets Sarah to perpetuate this lie. So imagine being in that position where Sarah, of course, doesn't want to end up in Abimelech's harem. And yet, in order to protect her husband, who he is insisting to her, the only way to save me is by perpetuating this lie and being in this position, she does so in accordance with what her husband told her to do. So when Abraham is being active in his marriage, we see that he's placing his own needs well above those of his wife. As we bring that forward and consider what is the role of the husband is to be, the Apostle Paul in Ephesians chapter 5 tells us that husbands are to be marked by a Christ-like servant leadership over their wives. And how Paul defines that Christ-like servant leadership is by Christ's example sacrificially in his redemptive work for us. That even as Christ came and gave himself in order to redeem his bride, he literally laid down his life for us. So godly husbands are to be regularly laying down their lives for the sake of their wives. Abraham is doing the exact opposite. He's protecting his own life at the expense of his wife. Christian husbands should learn from Abraham's example and learn we ought instead not to paradigm ourselves after Abraham, but look to Christ as the example of what it means to love in a self-sacrificing way that leads from placing ourselves in the position of vulnerability rather than putting others between us and danger. We're called to be protective leaders of those under our care, not those who use others as human shields.
Wives are called to be submissive to their husbands, so is it a good thing that Sarah keeps submitting to Abraham's bad plans?
You know, there's a text in the New Testament in 1 Peter chapter 3 that is explaining the roles and relationships between husbands and wives. So it says there at the beginning, likewise, wives, be subject to your own husbands, so that even if some do not obey the word, they may be won without a word by the conduct of their wives. And then later jumps down to call out a specific example For this is how the holy women who hoped in God used to adorn themselves, by submitting to their own husbands, as Sarah obeyed Abraham, calling him Lord. And you are her children if you do good and do not fear anything that is frightening. Now, a lot of people will look at that text in 1 Peter, will then assign that text and what it's alluding to our text in Genesis 20 of this sister fib where Sarah seems to submit to Abraham's counsel that, hey, you need to lie for me, and then things are going to be better off for me. So if you really love me, you're going to tell this lie, and you're going to go sleep with this Philistine king. They'll take that New Testament text in 1 Peter and say, well, Peter is endorsing what Abraham did here and saying, yeah, Christian wives should submit to their husbands in everything, even if the husband asks his wife to sin. In reality, I think that that's a misunderstanding of 1 Peter chapter 3. 1 Peter chapter 3 is not referring to Genesis chapter 20. It's referring to Genesis chapter 18. In Genesis chapter 18, Sarah, when she hears that she is going to have a child in her old age, remember she's listening in to Abraham discussing with these three men who are visiting, she sort of laughs in her heart, and then we get this inner dialogue where she says, shall my master have a child even though he is so old? And that word master is the same word in the Greek translation of the Old Testament, kurios, Lord, which is used in 1 Peter when it says Sarah obeyed Abraham, calling him Lord. So the submission that 1 Peter 3 is talking about is Sarah's submission to Abraham as Abraham believed in the promise and called his wife Sarah to say, let's believe this promise together and let's do the unthinkable thing at our age, which is try to conceive a child. Let's trust God's promises in faith. And even though Sarah, as we've seen, is somewhat a reluctant believer in these promises, she has doubts and concerns, and she says, am I to have pleasure? I'm worn out. I'm well past childbearing years. Yet she submits to Abraham. She submits to Abraham's following of the promises of God, and they end up having Isaac. So Genesis 18 is what's in view in 1 Peter chapter 3. Women are called to submit to their husbands as husbands are called to lovingly lead as servant leaders their wives. But the submission to a husband is a secondary submission to a Christian woman's submission to God. So insofar as any husband would ask his wife to do something that is sinful, that disobeys God's law, then it would be a sinful thing to submit to that request. All of our allegiance belongs first to the one who made us, who fashioned us, whose law is right and just and good. And so any submission belongs to him first, and every submission that exists secondarily to that flows out of our greater submission to God. So a wife cannot submit to her husband in a godly way if she is not first submitting to what God has called her to do and to be, and that is to pursue righteousness and do goodness. And God never asks us to sin.
If you have any questions from the sermon or the sermon passage that you would like to have answered on the podcast, please email them by 8 a.m. on Tuesday morning to questions@westcannon.org. We'll see you next week.